The watchful eye of Bob the mailman. In the quiet suburb of Rosewood, the dependable hum of life moved in sync with the tick of the town's aged clock tower. Amidst the familiarity of painted fences, blooming flower beds, and the weekly rituals of lawn mowing, there was Bob, the neighborhood's beloved mailman. To most, he was simply the man who cheerfully carried letters, bills, and postcards, but to those who knew him best, Bob was more than a mailman. He was Rosewood's unofficial guardian. Rain or shine, he wore his uniform with a sense of purpose that hinted at more than just a job. He was woven into the fabric of Rosewood's community. Bob had a knack for noticing things, not just the surface-level details, like the peculiarities of people's gardens or the freshly painted front doors, but the subtle shifts in the everyday scenes of the homes he visited. He could recall the names of every child on his route, knew which houses had dogs that barked at his presence, and could even predict who would linger a little longer at the mailbox to chat. And then there was the Peterson family. To most, the Petersons were the quintessential quiet family. They kept to themselves, polite but reserved. Their house was a modest two-story home with a white picket fence and a garden that once thrived but now seemed a little less loved. Bob could remember Mrs. Peterson tending to the flowers each spring, her laughter as bright as the blooms she carefully planted. However, in recent weeks, the garden had started to wilt, and the house itself seemed heavier, as if carrying a secret weight. The laughter and light that once radiated from the house had dimmed, replaced by drawn curtains and a silence that felt almost stifling. It was Lily, the Petersons' 10-year-old daughter, who most concerned Bob. Bright-eyed and quick to smile, Lily had always been a little bundle of energy. She would wait eagerly at the gate whenever Bob passed by, asking if there was any exciting news in his bag for her. She had a way of making each interaction feel like a mini-adventure, and her giggles would often echo down the quiet street. Yet recently, that spark seemed to have vanished. Bob noticed that she rarely ventured outside, her place by the gate now empty. On the rare occasion he did catch sight of her, her usual lively demeanor had been replaced by a withdrawn expression, her eyes reflecting an emotion that made Bob uneasy. One afternoon, as Bob approached the Peterson house, he caught sight of a figure standing near the mailbox. He recognized Lily immediately. She looked different, smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. Bob's heart ached at the sight. He walked over with his usual jovial air, though he felt an unusual heaviness in his chest. "Hey there, Miss Lily," he greeted, crouching down to her level. "I haven't seen you in a while. Thought you might have gotten tired of seeing my old mug." Lily looked up, her lips forming a tentative smile, but it faded as quickly as it had appeared. Her eyes, which once danced with curiosity, were dull, tinged with an unspoken fear. As he reached out to hand her a letter, his eyes fell on a dark stain on her pants, a stain so out of place that his hand froze mid-motion. His heart pounded as his mind raced through the possibilities, each one darker than the last. "Lily," he began softly, his voice laced with concern. "Did you have a little accident? Did you fall and hurt yourself?" Lily stiffened, her gaze dropping back to the ground. She mumbled something too faint to hear, her voice trembling. Instinctively, Bob reached out, his hand gentle as he touched her shoulder. He could feel her tiny body trembling, and the realization sent a chill down his spine. "Lily." He tried again, his tone more serious, yet still warm. "It's all right. You can tell me if something's wrong." The little girl swallowed hard, her small hands clenching into fists. She took a shallow breath and, without meeting his eyes, whispered, I can't." The tension in her voice, the weight of her whispered words, told Bob all he needed to know. Something was terribly wrong, and she was too afraid to speak about it. His mind flashed to Mr. Peterson, whom he'd recently noticed leaving for work looking more exhausted than ever, and to Mrs. Peterson, who had once been the picture of suburban contentment, but now seemed a shadow of her former self. He could no longer ignore the feeling that something deeply troubling was unfolding behind the Petersons' closed doors. Bob's hand moved to gently lift Lily's chin, bringing her gaze up to meet his. Her eyes glistened with unused tears, and her face was etched with a mix of shame and fear that no child her age should ever feel. "Did someone hurt you?" he asked softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing within him. He could feel the weight of her silence, her hesitancy to respond, as if the very air around them had thickened with unspoken words. After what felt like an eternity, Lily gave a slight nod, barely noticeable, but it was enough to confirm Bob's worst fears. His pulse quickened, anger and sorrow mingling, as he processed the silent plea for help he just received. He noticed her look over her shoulder toward the house, fear flickering in her eyes, as if someone inside could be watching them. Without thinking, Bob knelt down, his eyes level with hers, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Lily," he said softly, his voice filled with a reassuring warmth. "I'm here to help. I promise." He took a quick, steadying breath, trying to make sense of his next move. He knew he needed to act fast, but carefully. He'd heard stories of children trapped in abusive situations, and he had no intention of letting Lily remain in one. He quickly stood up, taking her hand gently in his, and guided her toward his mail truck, feeling the weight of her silent trust with each step. Once he had her safely seated, he glanced back at the Peterson house. The curtains remained drawn, obscuring any view of the inside, and the front door stayed ominously shut. He returned to the driver's side, his mind racing. Taking out his phone, his fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the familiar numbers of 911. As the line connected, he forced himself to remain calm, his voice steady as he relayed the situation to the dispatcher. "I need assistance," he said, keeping his voice low, glancing back at Lily with a reassuring nod. "I believe there's a case of child abuse happening at the Peterson residence on Rosewood Drive. The child is with me, and she's injured. I think it's serious." The dispatcher's voice was calm but professional, reassuring him that help was on the way. Bob ended the call, feeling the surge of relief mingling with his lingering worry. He turned to Lily, his expression softening as he took her hand in his. "Help's coming, all right," he murmured, giving her hand a comforting squeeze. "You're safe now, Lily. I won't let anything else happen to you." As they waited, an eerie calm settled over the street. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Bob looked at Lily, who was huddled beside him, her small hands clutching his for reassurance. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, knowing that whatever was behind that dark stain on her pants was a story that would be harder to unravel than he could imagine. Unmasking the darkness. As Bob sat with Lily in the quiet confines of his mail truck, the weight of the situation bore down on him, and he struggled to keep his composure. He'd encountered all kinds of people on his route over the years. Families, elderly folks, lonely souls, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. The sight of Lily's frightened face, her small frame hunched and vulnerable, was etched in his mind. He gently placed a blanket around her shoulders, as much to comfort her as to reassure himself that he was doing something, anything, to help her. The silence that enveloped them was broken only by the sound of approaching sirens, growing louder with each passing second. As the red and blue lights drew closer, Bob felt an unusual mixture of relief and anxiety. He had no doubt that involving the authorities was the right thing, but a small part of him feared what might come next. This was no longer just his concern, or even the concern of a few watchful neighbors. It was about to become the business of everyone in Rosewood. The police cars pulled up, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the otherwise peaceful street. Officers stepped out, their expressions shifting from the usual stoic professionalism to genuine concern as they looked from Bob to the small, frightened girl by his side. One officer, a kind-looking man named Officer Walker, approached, his eyes softening as he crouched down to Lily's level. "Hello, sweetheart," he said in a gentle tone, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'm Officer Walker. We're here to help, okay?" Lily nodded, her hand still clutching Bob's tightly. Bob gave her a comforting squeeze, encouraging her with a small nod. The officers asked Lily a few gentle questions, keeping their voices low and calm. She barely spoke, her voice a mere whisper as she mumbled her answers, her gaze darting nervously back toward her house. Bob felt the strain in her silence, the fear that seemed to shroud her every response. His chest tightened as he imagined the ordeal this young girl must have endured to be this afraid. He wanted nothing more than to take away her pain, to somehow undo all the terrible things that had left her so fragile. But he knew that healing wouldn't come so easily. It would take time, patience, and a whole lot of courage. As the officers continued their conversation with Lily, another officer approached Bob, notebook in hand. "Mr. Bob," the officer began, his tone both professional and empathetic. "You said on the call that you suspect abuse. Can you tell us what you saw that made you so concerned?" Bob took a steadying breath. "It was a stain on her pants," he began, his voice low as he recalled the chilling sight. "At first, I thought maybe she'd just taken a tumble, like any kid might. But then, I saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't just a fall or a scraped knee. It was something much worse. She's terrified to go back in that house, officer." The officer nodded solemnly, his pen moving quickly across the page. "We'll take it from here, Mr. Bob. Thank you for being vigilant." He gestured to the other officers, and they quickly moved toward the Peterson house, their expressions dark with the knowledge of what they might find inside. Bob watched them go, his heart pounding. As much as he wanted to turn away, he couldn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. Lily clung to his side, her small fingers gripping his hand as if he were her last lifeline. He knelt beside her, speaking softly. "You're safe, Lily. The police will make sure of it." The officers approached the house cautiously, their hands ready at their sides as they knocked on the door. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and Mr. Peterson appeared, looking disheveled and bleary-eyed. His face bore the unmistakable signs of someone who hadn't slept well in days, his eyes red-rimmed and glazed over. For a moment, he stared at the officers in confusion. Then his gaze shifted to the mail truck where Bob and Lily sat. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice a strange mix of irritation and defensiveness. "Mr. Peterson," one of the officers said calmly, "we received a report that your daughter, Lily, may have sustained an injury. We'd like to ask you a few questions." At the mention of Lily's name, Mr. Peterson's face darkened, his gaze narrowing. He took a step forward, his voice rising. "I don't know what you're talking about. Lily's fine. She's just a clumsy kid, always falling over something." Bob's fists clenched as he watched Mr. Peterson's dismissive demeanor. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, unassuming father he'd seen in passing over the years. The man standing before them was a stranger, an unsettling presence that radiated hostility. One of the officers gently but firmly explained that they would need to speak with both him and Mrs. Peterson to ensure Lily's well-being. With a huff, Mr. Peterson allowed them inside, reluctantly stepping aside to let the officers through. Bob watched them disappear into the house, every second feeling like an eternity. He held Lily close, her trembling growing more intense as the minutes dragged on. After what felt like an endless wait, two of the officers emerged from the house, their faces grim. One of them signaled to Bob, and he reluctantly let go of Lily's hand, moving to meet them a few steps away from the truck. "We've called for social services," one officer said, his voice heavy with the weight of the news. "It's worse than we thought. There's clear evidence of neglect and possible physical abuse. Lily's mother, she's in no state to protect her. She seems to be struggling herself, possibly dealing with her own set of issues." Bob's heart sank. He'd suspected that things weren't right, but hearing it confirmed was like a blow to the gut. He looked back at Lily, who sat curled up in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer hesitated, exchanging a glance with his partner. "For now, we're taking Lily to a safe place. She'll be evaluated, both physically and emotionally. Given the circumstances, it's likely she'll be placed in temporary foster care." Bob felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. The thought of Lily being sent away, lost in the impersonal maze of foster care, made him uneasy. He knew the system was meant to protect children, but he also knew it wasn't always a perfect solution. Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked, surprising even himself with the urgency in his tone. The officer gave him a thoughtful look. "Actually, yes. Having a familiar face in her life, someone she trusts, could make a world of difference. We'll need to go through the proper channels. But if you're willing, you could potentially be involved in her case, maybe even become a mentor or temporary guardian, if that's something you'd be open to." Bob didn't need a moment to think. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe," he replied firmly, his voice resolute. He glanced back at Lily, a small smile playing on his lips despite the gravity of the situation. "She deserves to have someone looking out for her." The officers nodded, their expressions softening as they saw the determination in Bob's eyes. They'd seen countless cases of abuse, but rarely did they witness a community member stepping forward with such a genuine commitment. It was a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them gently approached Lily, explaining in a soothing tone that she would be taken to a safe place where she could rest and receive care. Lily looked to Bob, her eyes pleading. "Will you come with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Bob knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "I'll be right there with you, Lily. You're not alone." He helped her into the back of the police car, keeping his hand on her shoulder as they sat together in silence. The ride to the local social services office was quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and Lily's soft breaths. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, feeling the weight of her trust settle over him like a solemn duty. At the social services office, they were greeted by a warm woman named Ms. Garza, who introduced herself as Lily's caseworker. She was patient and kind, kneeling down to Lily's level as she explained what would happen next. Lily nodded, her gaze shifting to Bob every few moments for reassurance. Ms. Garza noticed the bond between them and pulled Bob aside, her expression a mix of concern and gratitude. "Thank you for being here with her, Mr. Bob," she said, her voice sincere. "It makes a big difference to have someone she trusts, and I want you to know that your involvement can be as extensive as you'd like. We encourage familiar figures to stay close, especially during times of transition." Bob nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "She's a brave girl," he murmured, looking over at Lily. "And I'll do whatever it takes to help her through this." Ms. Garza offered a warm smile. "With people like you in her life, I think she'll be all right. It won't be easy, but with time and the right support, she can heal." As he watched Lily settle into the social services office, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair, Bob felt the first stirrings of hope. This wouldn't be the end of her story. There would be scars, and there would be difficult days ahead, but he knew in his heart that she had a strength far greater than she realized. And as he vowed silently to remain by her side, he felt the weight of his responsibility deepen into something more, a commitment to protect and nurture this brave young girl through every step of her journey, the fragile first steps toward healing. The days following the initial intervention were challenging, filled with new faces, sterile environments, and a whirlwind of unfamiliar procedures that left Lily feeling lost and overwhelmed. Bob visited her daily, always bringing something small, flowers from his garden, a storybook, or simply a reassuring smile. Each day, he watched her struggle with the weight of her fears, yet there was a quiet resilience in her, a spark he knew had survived despite everything she'd endured. After a few days in the temporary children's shelter, Lily was placed with a foster family, The Harpers, a kind and nurturing couple who had dedicated their lives to helping children in need. Their home was warm and inviting, with bright walls decorated with pictures and drawings from the children they'd fostered over the years. Mr. and Mrs. Harper were careful not to overwhelm Lily, giving her the space she needed while gently offering her a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. Bob was introduced to the Harpers by Ms. Garza, Lily's caseworker, who recognized the positive impact Bob had on Lily and arranged for him to continue being a part of her support system. On one of his first visits to the Harper home, Bob found Lily sitting alone in the backyard, her knees drawn to her chest as she gazed at the sky. Her foster parents were inside, giving her space while keeping a watchful eye on her from the kitchen window. She looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the open yard, her thin frame almost swallowed by the oversized sweater she wore. Bob approached her slowly, mindful of her need for calm, and sat beside her on the soft grass. "Hey there, Miss Lily," he said, offering her a warm smile. "Thought I'd come by and keep you company. It's a good day to be outside." Lily looked up, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness, but also a flicker of gratitude. She nodded, resting her chin on her knees. "It's quieter here," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone much older than her 10 years. "I like it, but it's still hard. I keep thinking." Her voice trailed off, as if the words themselves were too painful to speak. Bob waited, giving her time, hoping she'd find the courage to share what was troubling her. After a few moments, she took a shuddering breath and looked at him, her eyes haunted. "Why didn't anyone see it before, Mr. Bob?" she asked softly. Why didn't anyone stop him? The question cut deep, and for a moment, Bob was at a loss for words. He'd spent countless hours wrestling with that same question since the day he'd first seen the dark stain on her pants, wondering if he'd missed signs that could have saved her from suffering. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I don't know, Lily," he replied honestly, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had an answer for you. Sometimes grown-ups don't see what they should. But I'm here now, and so are a lot of other people. We're here to make sure you're safe." Lily's face softened, but the shadows in her eyes remained. "Sometimes I miss my mom," she whispered. "I know she didn't stop him either, but I miss her. She was so different before." Her voice broke off as tears filled her eyes, and she looked away, trying to hide her vulnerability. Bob's heart ached as he listened. He knew that Lily's mother, burdened by her own struggles, had failed to protect her. Yet he also understood that Lily's love for her mother was unbreakable, no matter how complicated their relationship had become. He placed his hand over hers, squeezing it gently. "It's okay to feel that way, Lily," he said softly. "Your mom, she's going through her own battles. But maybe with some help, she'll find a way to be stronger too. Sometimes people need a little help to find their way back." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the distance, lost in thought. After a long silence, she whispered, "Do you think she could get better, so we could be together again?" Bob took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think she's got a long road ahead, but yes, I believe she can get better. And you'll be safe, no matter what. There are a lot of people who care about you, Lily, people who won't let you face this alone." Over the following weeks, Bob continued his regular visits to the Harpers' home, becoming a steady and trusted presence in Lily's life. He and Ms. Garza worked closely with Lily's caseworker, discussing ways they could help her through the healing process. Lily had sessions with a trauma therapist who specialized in working with children, a warm-hearted woman named Dr. Albright, who quickly built a rapport with her. Dr. Albright used play therapy and gentle conversations to help Lily begin to understand her feelings, giving her tools to express her pain and fear in a safe environment. One afternoon, Bob was invited to attend one of Lily's therapy sessions. Dr. Albright believed it could be beneficial for Lily to have a familiar figure present as she navigated some of her deeper emotions. When he arrived at Dr. Albright's office, he found the therapist waiting with a kind smile, her presence calming. "Thank you for being here, Mr. Bob," she greeted him. "Lily's made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot she's trying to understand. Having you here could help her feel more supported as she starts to unpack some of those difficult memories." He nodded, grateful to be able to support Lily in whatever way he could. Dr. Albright led him into the therapy room, a cozy space filled with soft toys, drawing materials, and beanbags. Lily sat in the corner, coloring a picture of a field of flowers. She looked up as he entered, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Hi, Mr. Bob," she said, her voice softer than usual but tinged with relief. "Hi, Lily," he replied, taking a seat beside her. "That's a beautiful picture you're making. Those flowers look like they could be right out of a storybook." She giggled a little, the first genuine laughter he'd heard from her in weeks. "They're for you," she said, sliding the picture over to him. "I thought you might like them." Bob felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the picture, realizing it was her way of saying thank you. He carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket. "I'll treasure it," he said, giving her a gentle smile. Dr. Albright guided the conversation gently, helping Lily open up about the complex mix of emotions she felt, her sadness, her anger, and her confusion about her parents. As they spoke, she shared small pieces of her past, each revelation a heavy truth that left Bob feeling both heartbroken and hopeful. He could see the courage it took for her to voice these memories, to acknowledge the pain she'd kept hidden for so long. "I used to hide under my bed when he yelled," she admitted softly, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. "But sometimes, even that didn't work. I thought if I was quiet enough, maybe he'd stop." Bob clenched his fists, his heart aching for the little girl who'd had to face such terror alone. He wanted to tell her that she was safe now, that no one would ever hurt her again, but he knew words were only part of what she needed. She needed time and patience, a safe space where she could slowly rebuild her sense of security. As the weeks passed, Bob saw a gradual change in Lily. She became more open, her laughter returning little by little, her voice more confident as she began to trust those around her. The Harpers continued to provide her with a stable and loving environment, fostering an atmosphere where she felt valued and understood. They celebrated her small victories, whether it was trying a new hobby or simply sharing her feelings, and each step forward, however small, felt monumental. One evening, during a visit to the Harpers' home, Lily pulled Bob aside and took him to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at him with a quiet intensity. "Mr. Bob," she began, her voice steady, "I want to write a letter to my mom. Do you think that's okay?" Bob considered her request, understanding the deep emotional need behind it. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Lily," he replied gently. "Sometimes writing down how we feel can help us understand things better. And if you want, I can help you." She nodded, a glimmer of determination in her eyes. Together, they sat at her small desk, and she began to write. At first, her words were hesitant, a jumble of emotions filling onto the paper, but gradually she found her voice. She wrote about her fear, her sadness, and her hope that her mom would get better. Bob sat beside her, his heart swelling with pride at the strength she showed in confronting her feelings. When she finished, she looked up at him, a hint of vulnerability in her gaze. "Do you think she'll read it?" Bob placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I think she will, Lily. And I think it will mean a lot to her." The letter marked a turning point in Lily's healing process. She was still a long way from fully processing everything she'd been through, but she was beginning to reclaim her voice, to acknowledge her pain and take small steps toward healing. Bob continued to be a constant in her life, visiting her regularly, supporting her through therapy, and reminding her every day that she was not alone. As spring approached, bringing warmer weather and blooming flowers, Bob and Lily spent more time outdoors, exploring parks and gardens, letting her reconnect with the innocence of childhood. With each passing day, her laughter grew a little louder, her smile a little brighter, and Bob knew that, In time, she would emerge from her pain stronger than ever. The journey was far from over, but as he watched her blossom, he felt an unshakable belief that one day she would be free from the shadows of her past. He would be there every step of the way, a steady presence guiding her toward the future she deserved. The power of friendship and second chances. As spring warmed into summer, Lily's progress continued to blossom. The Harpers organized small outings, inviting children from the neighborhood to join in, hoping to gently reintroduce Lily to the joy of friendship. She was hesitant at first, clinging to Bob or Mrs. Harper whenever new kids approached, but gradually she began to open up, her laughter a welcome addition to the neighborhood's quiet days. One warm afternoon, the Harpers arranged a picnic at Rosewood Park, a sprawling green space just a few blocks from their home, with wide open fields and shady spots under towering oak trees. They spread blankets beneath one of these oaks, setting out a variety of sandwiches, fruits, and snacks. Lily, wearing a sun hat that Mrs. Harper had given her, sat close to Bob, her eyes darting around at the other children who played nearby. She held her sandwich with both hands, taking small bites as she watched the other kids laugh and run. A small group of children approached them, their smiles friendly and open. Among them was Sophie, a girl with curly hair and a playful sparkle in her eye, who quickly noticed Lily's hesitation and offered her an invitation with a simple, "Wanna come play?" Lily looked to Bob, her eyes filled with both excitement and uncertainty. Bob offered her a reassuring nod. "It's okay, Lily. Go on and have some fun. I'll be right here if you need me." With a slight smile, she stood and joined the group, her steps tentative at first, but gaining confidence as the other children welcomed her. They played tag, took turns swinging on the monkey bars, and even organized a game of hide and seek. Bob watched from a distance, his heart swelling as he saw her laughter and joy returning. She looked like any other child, free, spirited, and completely absorbed in the moment. It was the first time he'd seen her like this since she'd been taken from her family home. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and excitement. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, Lily ran back to Bob, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shining with happiness. "Did you see me, Mr. Bob? I was the last one caught in hide and seek," she said proudly, her voice brimming with excitement. Bob chuckled, ruffling her hair. "I did see, and you were amazing. Look at you, making friends and having fun. I'm so proud of you, Lily." She beamed, a confidence shining in her eyes that had been missing for so long. The simple joy of being a child, of laughing and playing without worry, was beginning to feel like a possibility for her once more. After the picnic, Bob and Lily walked back to the Harpers' home, her hand in his, her step light, and her heart open. As they walked, she spoke freely, sharing her thoughts and dreams in a way she hadn't before. "I want to be a teacher one day," she confided, her voice soft but filled with hope, "so I can help kids like me. I think maybe I'd be good at it." Bob looked down at her, moved by the strength of her dream. "I think you'd be an incredible teacher, Lily. You have a kind heart and a brave spirit. Any kid would be lucky to have you guiding them." They reached the Harpers' house, and Mrs. Harper greeted them with a warm smile. "Sounds like you two had a wonderful time," she said, noticing the happiness in Lily's face. She wrapped her arm around Lily, who leaned into the embrace, savoring the feeling of safety and love. Later that evening, as Lily settled into her bed, she looked at Bob, who sat beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "Mr. Bob, do you think my mom misses me?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with longing. Bob nodded, his heart aching at the rawness of her question. "I think she does, Lily. And I think she's working hard to get better, so she can be the mom you deserve." Lily closed her eyes, a small sigh escaping her lips. "I hope so. I want to see her again, but I don't want things to be like before." Bob gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "That's completely understandable, Lily. And if you're ever ready to see her again, I'll be right here with you. You're not alone in this." Over the next few weeks, Lily's therapy sessions became more in-depth, and as she opened up more, Dr. Albright and Ms. Garza decided it might be time for Lily to begin a carefully supervised process of reconnecting with her mother, who was in a recovery program that provided support for mothers and families impacted by abuse. The news came as a surprise to Bob, who'd hoped for this moment but hadn't anticipated it happening so soon. However, both Dr. Albright and Ms. Garza believed that Lily had reached a point in her healing where seeing her mother, if only briefly, might help her find closure, regardless of what the future held. When they shared the news with Lily, she was silent for a moment, processing it with the seriousness of someone far beyond her years. Then she looked at Bob, her eyes searching for his reassurance. "Will you come with me?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Bob's answer was immediate. "Of course, Lily. I'll be with you every step of the way." On the day of the meeting, Bob arrived at the Harpers' house early, helping Lily get ready and assuring her with gentle words. As they drove to the family center where her mother was staying, he could feel her anxiety building, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a warm, comforting smile. "It's okay to feel nervous," he said. "You're incredibly brave for doing this, Lily. Just remember, whatever happens, I'm here, and you're safe." When they arrived at the family center, they were greeted by Ms. Garza, who led them to a quiet room filled with soft chairs and warm lighting. Lily clutched Bob's hand tightly as they waited, her breath shallow with anticipation. Moments later, the door opened, and Mrs. Peterson walked in, looking hesitant and vulnerable. She seemed smaller, her face drawn and her eyes downcast, as if the weight of her past had physically changed her. But when she saw Lily, her eyes softened, and tears filled them. "Lily," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lily looked at her mother, her expression a mix of longing and caution. She didn't let go of Bob's hand, but she managed a small, tentative smile. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice barely audible. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken apologies and memories neither of them could ignore. Mrs. Peterson took a tentative step forward, her eyes never leaving Lily's. She knelt down, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I know I let you down. I know I wasn't there to protect you. But I want you to know, I'm trying to be better. I'm working hard so that, maybe one day, we can be a family again, a real one. I love you, sweetheart." I never stopped. Tears streamed down Lily's cheeks as she listened, her small fingers clenching Bob's hand. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she was ready to forgive, but she felt a warmth in her mother's words that she hadn't felt in a long time. Are you getting better, Mom?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. Mrs. Peterson nodded, wiping her own tears. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm working very hard. I want to be the mom you deserve. I don't know how long it will take, but I'm not giving up." Lily looked at Bob, seeking reassurance, and he gave her a small nod, his gaze filled with pride. She turned back to her mother, her expression softening. I hope you do, Mom, because I miss you. But I don't want things to be like they were before," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet strength. Mrs. Peterson nodded, her face etched with remorse. "I understand, Lily. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." After a while, Ms. Garza gently ended the session, sensing that Lily was emotionally drained. They said their goodbyes, and Mrs. Peterson promised to keep working on herself, hoping one day to be worthy of Lily's love and trust again. As they left the family center, Lily clung to Bob, her small body exhausted from the emotional weight of the day. "I'm proud of you, Lily," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You were incredibly brave." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears, but filled with a new sense of peace. "Thank you, Mr. Bob," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him in a hug. "Thank you for being here." That evening, as they returned to the Harpers' home, Lily seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The visit with her mother had been emotionally draining, but it had given her a glimpse of hope, a hope that, while her past was filled with pain, her future could be different. She didn't know if her mother would ever fully recover, but she felt comforted knowing that she wasn't alone in facing these difficult moments. Over the weeks that followed, Lily's confidence grew, her laughter becoming a regular sound in the Harpers' home. She continued her therapy sessions, processing her feelings about her mother, her past, and her hopes for the future. Bob remained a steady presence in her life, his role as her confidant and friend unwavering. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard, Lily looked at him with a look of gratitude and affection. "I want to help people when I grow up," she said softly. "Like you helped me. I want to make a difference." Bob felt a surge of pride and emotion, seeing in her the potential for a future far brighter than he could have ever hoped for. "You already are making a difference, Lily, just by being you, by being brave. And you're going to grow up to do amazing things. I just know it." As summer turned to fall, Lily's future looked brighter than ever. The once frightened little girl was beginning to find herself, to reclaim her joy, her laughter, and her dreams. And with Bob, the Harpers, and her growing circle of support, she knew that she was no longer alone, that she had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. For the first time in her life, Lily truly believed in the possibility of happiness, and that belief, fragile as it was, became the foundation of a future filled with hope and healing, embracing a new normal. As autumn settled over Rosewood, the trees lining the streets transformed into a symphony of red, orange, and yellow, their leaves creating a vibrant blanket on the ground. For Lily, each fallen leaf felt like a reminder that life was moving forward, and she was moving forward with it. The shadows of her past still lingered, but they no longer dominated her thoughts. She was beginning to feel that maybe, just maybe, she had a place in this world where she could be safe, loved, and accepted. The Harpers, who had quickly become more than foster parents, continued to support her, celebrating her small victories and offering steady reassurance during the tough days. They encouraged her to explore her interests and introduced her to new experiences, from art classes to weekend hikes. Under their care, Lily started to discover parts of herself she hadn't known existed: creativity, curiosity, and even a love for painting. One weekend, Mr. Harper set up a small easel in their backyard, bringing out an array of paints and brushes. "Here you go, Lily," he said with a warm smile. "Thought you might enjoy painting some of these beautiful fall colors." Lily's eyes sparkled as she picked up a brush, dipping it into a deep red hue. She looked around at the leaves scattered across the yard and began painting, her strokes tentative at first, but growing bolder as she found her rhythm. She painted for hours, losing herself in the colors, and by the time she finished, the canvas held an abstract landscape, a mix of reds, yellows, and greens swirling together in a vibrant dance. She felt a surge of pride and contentment as she looked at her work. "Wow, Lily," Mrs. Harper said, admiring the painting. "You've got a real talent for this." Lily blushed, shyly glancing at her feet. "It's just colors," she murmured, but there was a hint of pride in her voice. "It's more than that," Mrs. Harper replied gently. "It's a piece of you." That night, as she lay in bed, Lily thought about her painting, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. She had created something beautiful out of colors and strokes, transforming her emotions into something tangible. It was the first time in a long while that she felt truly in control of her own story. Meanwhile, Bob continued to play an integral role in her life, his presence a constant source of comfort. He'd become like a father figure to her, someone she could rely on without fear of disappointment or harm. On weekends, they often went on small adventures, exploring nearby nature trails or visiting the local library, where they'd browse shelves filled with stories from worlds far beyond Rosewood. Bob encouraged her to pick out books, sharing stories from his own childhood and pointing out ones he thought she might like. One crisp Saturday morning, as they wandered through the park's winding trails, Lily confided in Bob about her art, explaining how painting made her feel calm, as if she could pour out her worries with each brushstroke. "Maybe I could paint my feelings one day," she said, her voice tentative. "Like the bad ones. Do you think that would help?" Bob looked at her thoughtfully. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Lily. Art can be a powerful way to let out things that are hard to say. Sometimes, the things we can't talk about become clearer when we paint them, draw them, or even write them down." Encouraged by his words, Lily began using art as a way to process her emotions. She'd paint whenever she felt overwhelmed, her brush capturing the dark shades and bright colors of her experiences. It became a quiet therapy of its own, one that allowed her to confront her memories without fear. Her work was raw, powerful, and sometimes dark, but it was always honest, a true reflection of her inner world. One evening in October, Ms. Garza visited the Harpers' home to discuss an important matter. She sat in the living room with Bob, the Harpers, and Lily, her tone gentle yet serious. After exchanging pleasantries, she looked at Lily, her expression softening. "Lily," Ms. Garza began, "I have some news that I'd like to share with you. Over the past few months, your mom has made significant progress in her recovery program. She's been working hard, not just for herself, but because she wants to be a better mom to you." Lily shifted uncomfortably, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her sweater. The thought of her mom stirred a mixture of hope, love, and fear within her, and she didn't quite know how to respond. "She's asked to see you again," Ms. Garza continued, her voice soft but encouraging. "Only if you're ready and comfortable. There's no rush, and you don't have to make any decisions right now." Lily took a deep breath, glancing at Bob for reassurance. He gave her an encouraging nod, his expression calm and steady. "I don't know if I'm ready yet," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss her, but I'm still scared." "That's completely okay, Lily," Mrs. Harper said gently, reaching out to hold her hand. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. Your feelings are the most important thing here." Over the following days, Lily wrestled with her feelings, unsure whether she wanted to see her mother. She sought comfort in her art, painting a series of pieces that expressed the conflicting emotions swirling within her. One painting was especially dark, with harsh brushstrokes and muted colors, capturing the pain and fear she still carried. Another was lighter, filled with soft pastels and warm shades, symbolizing the hope she held for her mother's recovery. After a week of contemplation, Lily came to a decision. She approached Bob as they sat in the Harpers' backyard, watching the leaves fall gently from the trees. "Mr. Bob," she began, her voice trembling but resolute, I think I'd like to see my mom, but only if you're there with me." Bob looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course, Lily. I'll be right there beside you." The meeting was arranged for the following weekend at the family center where her mother was still undergoing treatment. Lily prepared herself mentally, practicing deep breaths and using the painting she'd done to express her fears as a source of strength. She brought the painting with her, a physical reminder of her journey and everything she'd endured. When they arrived at the family center, Bob and Lily waited together in a quiet room filled with soft lighting and gentle music. Ms. Garza sat nearby, providing support but giving them space. The door opened, and Mrs. Peterson entered, her face visibly softened from months of therapy and introspection. Her eyes met Lily's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Hi, Lily," Mrs. Peterson greeted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm so glad to see you." Lily managed a small smile, clutching her painting close to her chest. "Hi, Mom," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Peterson knelt down to Lily's level, her eyes welling with tears as she looked at her daughter. "I want you to know, I'm so sorry for everything. I know I wasn't the mom you deserved, and I can't ever take back the pain I caused. But I'm working every day to be better, for you and for myself." Lily's grip on her painting tightened as she tried to find the words to express the mix of emotions inside her. She took a shaky breath, then held out the painting to her mother. "I made this," she said softly, her voice wavering. "It shows how I feel about everything." Mrs. Peterson took the painting, her hands trembling as she looked at it. Her eyes scanned the dark colors, the sharp lines, and the somber tones, and she seemed to understand the depth of Lily's pain. She looked back at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Lily," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and sorrow. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I'm going to keep trying, for as long as it takes." They sat together, an unspoken understanding forming between them. Lily didn't know if she was ready to forgive entirely, but she felt a small spark of hope, a hope that maybe, with time, they could rebuild something different, something healthier. She knew the journey would be long, but she felt reassured knowing that she didn't have to walk it alone. After the meeting, Bob and Lily returned to the Harpers' home. As they walked up the front steps, Lily took his hand, her grip firm and steady. "Thank you for being there with me, Mr. Bob," she said softly. "I don't think I could have done it without you." Bob looked down at her, his expression warm and proud. "You're an incredibly strong girl, Lily. You faced something difficult today, and you did it with such courage. I'm so proud of you." As they entered the house, Mrs. Harper greeted them with open arms, her face beaming with pride. She'd been following Lily's progress closely, and seeing her take such a brave step brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Lily," she said, enveloping her in a warm hug. That night, as Lily settled into bed, she felt a newfound sense of peace. She still had questions, and the road ahead was uncertain, but she felt ready to face whatever came her way. She had a support system, a place she could call home, and people who believed in her. She was no longer the frightened little girl who hid in the shadows of her past. She was Lily, brave, resilient, and filled with the quiet strength she'd cultivated over the months. Before drifting off to sleep, she whispered to herself, "I'm going to be okay." And for the first time, she truly believed it. A path forged by resilience. Winter crept into Rosewood, coating the town in a blanket of snow. It was a season of quiet and introspection, a perfect reflection of the journey Lily had been on. She stood by the window one December morning, watching flakes fall and gather on the ground, each one adding to the pure, untouched white that stretched across the yard. There was a sense of renewal in the cold air, a silent promise that, just like the earth beneath the snow, she too was changing, growing stronger beneath the surface. Since her meeting with her mother, Lily had continued to work through her feelings with Dr. Albright, her therapist, often using art to help express her emotions. The dark paintings she'd once produced had given way to lighter tones, brighter colors, and softer lines. Her art was still deeply emotional, but it was no longer filled with shadows. Instead, each piece reflected a sense of hope and transformation. One evening, Mrs. Harper suggested displaying her artwork around the house, turning Lily's journey into a gallery of resilience and growth. They spent an afternoon arranging the paintings, each one telling a different part of Lily's story. As she stepped back to look at the collection, pride welled up within her. She could see her journey, the raw pain, the anger, the loneliness, and finally, the beginnings of joy and hope. Each painting was a reminder of her strength and the courage it had taken to confront her past. As Christmas approached, Lily felt an unfamiliar excitement stirring within her. It was her first holiday with the Harpers, and the warmth and care they put into every little detail was unlike anything she'd experienced before. Mrs. Harper helped her bake cookies, their laughter filling the kitchen as flour dusted their clothes and countertops. Mr. Harper showed her how to decorate the tree, explaining the meaning behind each ornament they placed. One evening, as they gathered around the fireplace with mugs of hot cocoa, Mr. Harper shared stories of his own childhood, telling Lily about the winters he'd spent building snowmen and sledding down the steep hill near his childhood home. He described the joy of waking up on Christmas morning, his voice soft with nostalgia. Lily listened intently, absorbing every word, every story. She'd never known this kind of warmth and love before, and she felt a mixture of gratitude and longing, a deep wish that her own past had been filled with such moments. But as she sat with the Harpers, she began to understand that, even though she couldn't change the past, she had the power to shape her future. The realization was both empowering and comforting. On Christmas Eve, the Harpers gathered around the tree, their faces glowing in the soft light of the holiday decorations. They handed Lily a carefully wrapped present, and she unwrapped it slowly, savoring the moment. Inside was a set of new paintbrushes and a stack of high-quality canvases, accompanied by a heartfelt note that Mrs. Harper had written. "To our dear Lily," it read, "we are so proud of the courage you've shown and the light you bring into our lives. Your strength inspires us every day, and we can't wait to see the beautiful art you'll create. With love, Mr. and Mrs. Harper." Tears filled Lily's eyes as she looked up at them, overwhelmed by their kindness. She hugged them both tightly, feeling a deep sense of belonging. For the first time, she felt truly at home, a part of something warm and safe. That evening, as she lay in bed, she thought about her mother. Ms. Garza had updated her on her mother's progress, sharing that she continued to work hard in her recovery. Lily wasn't ready to see her again just yet, but the knowledge that her mother was committed to getting better brought her a sense of peace. She'd come to understand that love and healing didn't always look the way she expected. Sometimes they were found in the quiet support of people who genuinely cared, and other times they came from allowing herself the space to grow at her own pace. The new year brought new beginnings for Lily. She enrolled in a local school, a milestone she approached with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The idea of meeting new people was daunting, but with encouragement from the Harpers and Bob, she decided to face it head-on. Bob had even given her a notebook, saying with a wink, "For all those brilliant ideas you're bound to have." She took it with her on her first day, clutching it tightly as she walked into her new classroom. To her relief, her classmates were welcoming, and her teachers were kind. She quickly befriended Sophie, the girl she'd met at the picnic months before. Sophie was bubbly and kind-hearted, and she had a knack for making Lily laugh. They spent their lunch breaks together, sharing stories and giggling over silly jokes. Slowly, Lily started to feel like she belonged, her confidence blossoming as she settled into her new school life. One afternoon after school, Sophie invited Lily over to her house, and they spent hours playing games, drawing, and sharing secrets. For the first time, Lily felt like a normal kid, free from the burdens that had once weighed her down. When she returned home that evening, she was glowing with happiness. "I made a friend, Mr. Bob," she announced excitedly when he came to visit that weekend. "Her name's Sophie, and she's really funny. We laughed so much, I thought I'd burst." Bob chuckled, his face lighting up with pride. "That's wonderful, Lily. You're building a life full of beautiful moments. I'm so happy for you." Her bond with Bob continued to grow, and he became her confidant, a source of wisdom and strength. They spent countless hours together, talking about her dreams and the things she wanted to accomplish. Lily shared her aspirations of becoming an art teacher, expressing a desire to help other children find joy and healing through art, just as she had. "I want to show kids that they can be strong," she explained, her eyes bright with passion. "I want them to know they're not alone." Bob listened, his heart swelling with pride. "You'd make a remarkable teacher, Lily. You have the compassion and the courage to make a real difference. I believe in you." As winter began to thaw into spring, Ms. Garza approached Lily with news that she could hardly believe. Her mother had reached a stable place in her recovery and had expressed a desire to write to her, to share her thoughts and apologize for the past. Ms. Garza handed Lily the letter, giving her the space to decide when and if she wanted to read it. Lily took the letter with trembling hands, a mixture of emotions coursing through her. She felt a deep curiosity, but also fear and doubt. She held on to it for days, uncertain about whether she was ready to confront the words her mother had written. Bob noticed her hesitation and offered his support, sitting with her one evening as she stared at the unopened letter in her hands. "Mr. Bob, what if she says something that hurts?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bob placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to read it, Lily, not unless you're ready. But remember, whatever's inside, you're strong enough to face it. You've already come so far." After a few more days of contemplation, Lily decided to open the letter. She read it slowly, each word sinking deep into her heart. Her mother apologized sincerely, acknowledging the pain she had caused and expressing a deep regret for not protecting Lily when she needed it most. She promised to keep working on herself, no matter how long it took, in hopes of one day being a mother Lily could be proud of. Lily felt a mix of sadness and hope as she finished reading. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive her mother, but she felt a strange comfort in knowing that her mother was trying to make things right, even if only from afar. She shared her feelings with Bob, who encouraged her to keep an open heart while still protecting herself. "You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, Lily," he reminded her. "Forgiveness is a journey, and you're the one who gets to decide the path." As spring turned to summer, Lily flourished. She continued to excel in school, her confidence growing with each new friend she made and each accomplishment she achieved. Her art had become a staple in the Harper home, and they even arranged for her to take a summer art class at the community center, where she developed her skills and found joy in expressing herself. By midsummer, Rosewood was abuzz with excitement for the annual fair, a celebration that brought the entire town together. The Harpers took Lily to the fair, where she rode the Ferris wheel, tried cotton candy for the first time, and laughed until their cheeks hurt. The fair felt like a symbol of her journey, a celebration of joy, resilience, and new beginnings. In the twilight hours, as they wandered through the fair's lights and sounds, Lily spotted a booth where children could paint small canvases to be displayed in the community center. She eagerly joined, creating a piece filled with bright colors and swirling patterns, a reflection of the happiness she felt. She titled it "New Beginnings" and placed it on the display table with a smile, feeling a sense of pride and peace. The summer drew to a close, and Lily's world was filled with possibilities she'd once thought impossible. She had a family who loved her, friends who valued her, and a future she could look forward to. She was no longer defined by the shadows of her past. Instead, she was defined by her resilience, her kindness, and her unwavering courage. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, Lily sat with Bob, her face aglow in the fading light. She looked up at him, her expression filled with gratitude. "I never thought I'd feel this happy, Mr. Bob," she said softly. "Thank you for believing in me." Bob smiled, his eyes misty with emotion. "I didn't do it alone, Lily. You're the one who had the strength to keep going, even when things felt impossible. You're a remarkable young lady, and I'm so proud of you." As they sat together, watching the stars blink into the night sky, Lily felt a deep sense of peace. Her life was far from perfect, and there would still be challenges, but she knew she could face them. She was surrounded by people who cared for her, and she had the strength within her to overcome anything. The past was a part of her story, but it no longer controlled her. She was free to dream, to laugh, and to build a future filled with hope. In that moment, Lily knew that she had truly found her place in the world, a place where she was loved, safe, and ready to embrace whatever came next. And as she looked up at the stars, she silently promised herself that she would continue to grow, to love, and to live a life filled with the light she had fought so hard to find.